I got a pass on the railroad, and I rode a chair car from Tulsa, Oklahoma to New York. And I got off of the train in New Jersey at that time, and I got on a ferry. The ferry was on, had a bus on there to take me across the river. So I looked out at the skyline of New York and said, my God, I wonder if I ever get in that place, if I'll ever find my way out again. So anyway, when I got over there, well, I checked the guitar and a suitcase with my other suit in it and put it in one of those things, you put a quarter in. So I walked out and I met a policeman out there and I said, which way is Broadway in Times Square? And he said, about 3 blocks west. So I walked over there, and I'd always dreamed of New York, with all the people in it and the lights and all of that kind of stuff. And this was on Sunday, and there was practically nobody out there in Times Square. And it was sort of a letdown. So then I checked in a hotel, and on Monday, well, I started looking for that big job making records, and I started walking up and down Broadway, and finally I walked in the office of RCA Victor, and I talked to the girl and the receptionist quite some time, and I left and went through 2 or 3 other places. Then I went back to Victor, and finally she said, what kind of songs do you sing? I said, well, I sing kind of country songs, and I did a couple of songs for her. And a couple of men walked through and stopped and listened to me. And, of course, one of them was the A&R vice president. And Frankie Marvin's brother, Johnny Marvin, was there.
Yeah.
And he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Oklahoma. And he said, well, that's strange. He said, I'm from Oklahoma, too. And he told me where he was from, out there in West Texas. I mean, in western part of Oklahoma. And so he says, my brother Frankie is out here. And says, I'll give you his phone number. You give him a call. Said he's lonesome up here, and he'll be glad to see you. So I called Frankie Marvin, and he and I became close buddies and started playing pool and talking about singing. And finally, though, I went over to American Record Corporation, and Art Satherley was there. And he heard me, and he said, Gene, said, I believe that I can use you over here. And I said, well, I've promised some folks over at Victor that I would come in and see them. And I think I better do that. He said, well, he said, Victor is a big company. He says they're a good company, but says they have several country groups over there, like the Carter family, and they have Jimmy Rogers.
Oh.
And he said, you might not fare as well there as you would over here. He said, because you would be the only star that we have over here with American Record Corporation. And I said, well, all right, Mr. Satherley, I'll think about it. I'll go over and see Mr. Watson. I'll think about it tonight, and then I'll let you know. So I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe I'd be better off at American Record Corporation. So I called Mr. Watson at Victor and told him I couldn't do it. Came back, and I said, all right, Mr. Satherley, I'm going to put myself in your hands. I'm going to stay over here with American Record Corporation. And that was my start in this business. Nat Levine was a producer out in Hollywood, and he was going to make a picture with Ken Maynard, so he went to New York to get his financing from Herb Yates, who owned Consolidated Films and also owned Columbia Records, which was making my records at that time. The label was on Challen's records, and Sears Roebuck carried them in their catalog. So they talked to Nat Levine and said, instead of just making an action picture, he said, why don't you consider using a singing cowboy? Said Gene Autry, one of our record artists, is out in Chicago, and he has a great following out there, and said, you might ought to consider that. So Nat Levine got in touch with me and asked me if I'd like to come out to Hollywood to do a picture. And he said, we're making a picture with Ken Maynard, and said, we'll write in a sequence for you, and it can be a film test. So I said, well, okay. So I went to Hollywood, and I appeared in the picture with Ken Maynard, and I did a couple of songs and a very small part. But anyway, after the picture was finished, I told my wife, I said, I don't know about this picture business. I think that I better go back to Chicago and stick with the radio. I don't want to get in pictures. So anyway, Nat Levine asked me if I would like to do a serial for him. And I said, well, I'm not sure that I can do that. I said, I'm really not an actor. He said, well, I'm willing to take a shot at it if you will do it. Says, I think you can do it. So my wife said, well, Gene said, I think maybe that you did a better job in the picture than you thought you did. Said, you have nothing to lose. Why don't you go ahead and do it?
It must have been quite an experience, going over there and opening a show in London. Did everybody went, I guess, a lot of the people from the studio?
Well, of course, Ina and I went along with Herbie Yates and his wife, and Bill Saul went along. And, of course, I took 2 horses over there. I took Champion, and then I took another horse over there with me at the time, Big Palomino. He was a beautiful horse. He died later. I never used him in pictures, but I took him over there, and he was called Robin Hood. And we took the van over there, this big van. And after we got over there, we couldn't use the van because it couldn't make the turns in those roads over there. They're very narrow. And so we had to use a van, one of the British vans. We used the horse in that. And a lot of things happened over there. I'll never forget this picture, though. It opened over there at the Paramount Theater in London. And there's a big crowd. Gosh, I never saw so many people in my life. The whole front of the theater, the streets were all blocked, and people everywhere.
Didn't you take Champ down and register him at the Savoy Hotel?
Yes, I did, Pat. I took Champion in the Savoy Hotel. They had a big news conference.
That must have shook them British up.
Well, I would say it kind of shook them up a little bit, though. And then after that, I went over to Ireland. And I opened at the Theatre Royal in Dublin, and they had the Irish sweepstakes on. And I had a wonderful time. I had a song that I picked up over there called South of the Border. And it was a big hit right from the start, and I recorded it. And the Irishmen over there, they would sing right along with you, you know. They had, over there, they had a bar. On the main floor, they'd have a bar on each side of the entrance inside. They called them pubs. Well, there's a pub on the right side and a pub on the left side. The balcony had a pub on the left side and a pub on the right side. And the mezzanine had a bar on each side. Well, those Irish would get in there and they'd start drinking that old Jameson whiskey, and they'd sing right along with me, and we had nothing but fun. Well, the crowds were so big that each night after the show was over, why, they rigged up a PA system and a microphone on the fire escape, and I would go outside and I would sing to them. I'd sing, maybe 3 or 4 songs, maybe sometimes 5 songs, because they couldn't get in to see the show. So finally, the word got out, that I would be out singing after the show, and they showed up. The crowds got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the last night that I was in Dublin, why, the crowd came out. They held me over an extra week. I was there 2 weeks. But the crowd was so big, and they'd holler, "I won't Gene, I won't Gene," and they knew that I was leaving. So I came out and waved to all of them and tried to sing a song, and they was all waving and hollering, so
singing.
And I bid them all farewell, and in unison they all started singing "Come Back to Erin."
Oh.
And I think that it brought tears to my eyes for the way they treated me over there. I never forgot it.
Oh, that must have been a wonderful experience.
It sure was. And then after that, why, we played in Glasgow, Scotland, Edinburgh, Scotland. I played in Birmingham. And I'll never forget, I played in Liverpool.
Oh, yeah.
Liverpool, England. And right across the bay, they have a big tunnel that goes over to Birkenhead. And I played 2 theaters in one day. I played a show in Liverpool, then I'd go over and play Birkenhead. And the newspaper the next day then had a headline that I'll never forget, because Hitler marched into Danzig, and that was the start of World War II while I was there in Liverpool. So the next day, why, in one of the London newspapers, or Liverpool, I forget which one, why, the headline read, "Hitler takes Danzig, American cowboy takes Liverpool."
Oh.
And I never forgot it.
In 1942, this was made. This was the last picture you made before you enlisted into the Air Force, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. That was the last picture that I made before I entered the Air Force.
Yeah.
And that was a strange year. Because
You went as just enlisted as an ordinary private and all, huh?
Well, originally the draft board called me.
Yeah.
That was about February. And they said, "Gene, we think that probably we're going to have to draft you in a few weeks for the Air Force. I mean, for the Army." And I said, "Well, when do you think?" And they said, "Well, you may be in the next draft." Said that could be pretty quick. And I said, "Well, I've got a lot of dates booked up because I have a brand new rodeo, and I've got a lot of money tied up in it, and I'll have to do something about that." I said, "At least I would like to fulfill all the engagements that I have booked before I go into the service." So they said, "Well, when is your last date?" And I said, "My last date is in July the 4th in Chicago at Soldier Field with the rodeo." And they said, "Well," said, "we will hold off drafting you until after July." So I talked to my attorney at that time, John O'Melveny, of O'Melveny and Myers, and I also went over and I talked to Herb Yates. I said, Mr. Yates, they tell me that they're going to draft me. Maybe the latest is in July. So if you want to make any pictures, why, you better get started on them because I am going to go in. And he said, well, said, listen, I don't think that you have to go, said, because I can ask deferment for you. And he said, we are important industry to the armed services, and says, we don't think you'll have to go. So I talked to John O'Melvin, and he said, Gene, I don't think you should let Yates ask for a deferment for you or to keep you out of the service. He said, there's a lot of the picture people that are going in the service. Jimmy Stewart's already in the service, and said Clark Gable has announced that he was entering the service, and said there's a lot of mothers and fathers out there that live on these farms, and says they're taking their sons, and says, I just don't think that'd be a good idea for you to do that, to ask for deferment. And I said, well, I agree with you. So I went back and I told Herb Yates then, I said, Herb, I'm not going to ask for a deferment in any way, and I don't want you to, because it might be embarrassing for me later on and also for you. And he really got up in arms all about that. So anyway, I decided to go into the Air Force. So I told the Wrigley Company also. I was under contract, long contract with the Wrigley Company. And I went to Hap Arnold, who was the commanding general of the Air Force, and I talked to him about going in the service. And he said, we certainly could use you. And he says, I'd like to use you, he says, in public relations and things of that sort. And I said, well, the main thing that I want to do is I'd like to be a pilot. I said, I've got a license as a private pilot. And he said, well, he said, the first thing to do, he says, is get in the Air Force first, and then we'll talk about that later. So I said, okay, that's all right with me. So I went ahead and did all the dates that I had, and did the rodeo in Chicago. And on July the 8th, that's when I finished, I went down and enlisted in the Air Force. So naturally, I was a private, and then right away, they assigned me to special duty, and then they made me a tech sergeant, and from there on, I did my job and later went into flying.
You know, you finally got overseas, is what you wanted.
Well, actually, what I was in,
Yeah.
To start with, I was in the training command.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to do was to get over into the Air Transport Command in the Fearing Division. So they finally transferred me to the Fearing Division, and I had to go to school and take a lot of flying in heavier aircraft than I had been used to flying.
We used to always play the Shriners hospitals and everything.
I got a lot of kick out of appearing in a hospital, regardless of where I played. I always made it a point to appear at a children's hospital and see those little faces smile, and it does your heart good. It warms you up.
And I know this because I've been with you when we were touring, and every time we played a town or anywhere near, they had the Shriners Crippled Children Hospital. We had to get there about 10 or 11 in the morning early and make a tour of the hospital, and Gene would sing, and entertain the kids, and that's been one of your big charity causes for years and years. They
Well,
do great work, don't they?
You don't know when you're well off until you visit some of the crippled children's hospitals all over the country, and you see those little kids with their smile on their face, and you're singing to them and get them to sing with you, and it's just it warms you up, makes you feel better.
Yeah, it does.